There's a moment, usually somewhere in a person's late 30s or 40s, though it can arrive earlier or later, that most people don't recognize while it's happening. Nothing dramatic marks it. No ceremony, no clear before and after. And yet, according to Carl Jung, this moment matters more than almost anything else that happens across an entire lifetime, because it's the point where the psychological task of being human quietly changes, whether or not you notice the shift. Jung called the first half of life one project, and the second half an entirely different one, run on different rules, aimed at a different goal. Most people, he argued, keep playing by the first half's rules long after that half is over, which is exactly why so many capable, successful people hit their 40s or 50s and find themselves disoriented by a question they can't quite name. I did everything right, so why does this feel so hollow? By the end of this video, you'll understand what Jung meant by the two halves of life, why the transition between them is so easy to miss, and what it actually looks like to notice you've arrived at it, even if nobody around you seems to be talking about it. This isn't a midlife crisis video promising a red car or a dramatic reinvention. It's about something quieter and more precise, a shift in psychological task that Jung considered as real and as necessary as the shift from childhood into adulthood, just far less visible and far less discussed. Jung developed this framework, often referred to as his theory of life's two halves, primarily through decades of clinical observation, noticing that his younger patients and his older patients tended to struggle with strikingly different problems, even when their external circumstances looked similar. Younger patients, broadly speaking, came to him needing help building something, a career, a stable identity, a family, financial security, a place in the world. The work of the first half of life, in Jung's model, is fundamentally about establishing yourself, developing a strong enough ego to function successfully within society, and adapting to the practical demands of the outer world. Older patients, particularly those who had genuinely succeeded at that first task, often arrived with a very different kind of problem. They had the career, the family, the stability, sometimes real wealth and real achievement, and yet many of them described a persistent sense of meaninglessness they couldn't quite explain, given how objectively well their lives appeared to be going by every external measure. Jung's interpretation was direct. These patients had successfully completed the first half's task, and were now facing the second half's task without realizing the rules had changed. The first half of life asks you to build an identity. The second half asks you to question it, deepen it, and eventually move beyond the parts of it that were only ever useful for establishing yourself in the world, not for living the fuller remainder of your life. If this is helping you make sense of a shift you've felt but never had language for, subscribe now, because this channel breaks down one piece of Jung's work every week, always explained clearly and applied to something real. Jung sometimes used the metaphor of a day to describe this shift, morning and afternoon, each requiring a completely different approach. You wouldn't run your afternoon the exact same way you ran your morning, chasing the same goals with the same urgency, and yet he observed that's precisely what most people try to do well into the second half of their lives, simply because nobody ever told them the goals were supposed to change. This is part of why the transition is so easy to miss. There's no formal marker, no graduation, no wedding, nothing society treats as a clear threshold the way it does with the transition into adulthood. The shift Jung is describing happens internally, often silently, and a person can be well into their 50s still operating entirely by first-half rules, wondering why accomplishments that used to feel satisfying now leave them strangely flat. To understand why the second half feels so disorienting, it helps to be specific about what the first half is actually for in Jung's model. The tasks of youth, broadly, involve separating from the family of origin, establishing a functional identity distinct from your parents, choosing a direction for work or vocation, often forming a partnership or family of your own, and building enough external stability, financial, social, professional, to function as a capable adult in the world. This is demanding, important work, and Jung never dismissed it as superficial or less valuable than what comes later. Someone who fails to complete this first-half task adequately, who never develops a strong enough ego structure, a stable enough identity, tends to struggle throughout their entire life, not just in youth. The first half matters enormously, and doing it well is genuinely difficult. But Jung noticed something specific about how this first half work gets accomplished. It almost always requires a degree of one-sidedness. To build a career, you develop certain strengths and necessarily neglect others. To fit into a particular social role, family, profession, community, you emphasize certain parts of your personality and suppress others, often the exact parts that don't serve the immediate practical goal of establishing yourself successfully. This isn't a mistake. It's close to unavoidable. Nobody builds a stable adult identity by developing every single potential equally, all at once. You specialize, you commit, you narrow your focus in order to actually accomplish something concrete in the world, and that narrowing is precisely what makes the first half of life so productive, and eventually so limiting. Think of it almost like clearing a single path through dense terrain. Choosing one direction, one career, one set of commitments lets you actually get somewhere, build momentum, develop real competence. The cost of that path, though, is that everything on either side of it stays unexplored, sometimes for decades, simply because there was never enough time or attention to walk in more than one direction at once. That unexplored terrain doesn't disappear. It waits quietly for whenever the path-building phase of life finally slows down enough to notice it's still there. Here's the part of Jung's model that tends to surprise people most. The more successfully someone completes the first half's task, the more likely they are to hit a genuinely difficult wall when the second half's task arrives, precisely because success in the first half often means becoming very good at a narrow, specialized version of yourself. The disciplined professional who built an entire career around competence and control often has an underdeveloped relationship with spontaneity, rest, or emotional vulnerability, the very qualities that become important once the second half's task begins. The person who spent decades prioritizing family and caretaking, sometimes at real cost to their own individual development, arrives at midlife having built enormous relational skill, but often with significant parts of their own individual identity still unexplored. Jung's patients who struggled most with this transition weren't, as a rule, people who had failed at life. Often the opposite. They were people who had succeeded so completely at the specific, narrow task of the first half that the parts of themselves excluded from that success had grown correspondingly large and correspondingly unfamiliar, waiting, essentially untouched, for a second half that eventually had to arrive. This is why external achievement alone rarely resolves the disorientation of this transition, and can sometimes make it worse. Another promotion, another milestone, another version of the same first-half accomplishment doesn't address a problem that isn't actually about accomplishment anymore. It's about the parts of the self that accomplishment was never designed to include in the first place, now asking, often for the first time in decades, to finally be given some room. So how does someone actually recognize they've arrived at this transition, given that there's no formal marker announcing it? Jung's clinical observations point to a few recurring signals, and they tend to show up as feelings before they show up as clear thoughts. The most common is a specific kind of flatness attached to achievements that used to feel satisfying. Not depression exactly, though it can shade into it if ignored long enough, but a persistent sense that the goals which organized your entire adult life so far no longer generate the same pull they once did, even when you're still technically succeeding at them. A second signal is the return of interests or qualities that were set aside decades earlier, often during the identity-building work of the first half. A structured, disciplined person suddenly drawn, almost against their own will, towards something unstructured and creative. Someone who built a career around independence feeling an unfamiliar pull toward community and connection they'd previously dismissed as unnecessary. A third, more uncomfortable signal is a growing intolerance for maintaining a persona that once felt effortless. Roles and performances that used to require no conscious effort at all start to feel, increasingly, like actual work, a subtle but unmistakable sign that the part of you still willing to perform them is shrinking, while a different, less accommodated part is asking for more direct expression. None of these signals arrive with a label attached. Most people experience them simply as vague dissatisfaction, restlessness, or a confusing loss of motivation for things that objectively should still matter to them, without ever connecting the dots to anything as specific as a shift in life's underlying task. There's often a fourth signal too, quieter than the other three, a changing relationship with time itself, where the first half tends to be organized around an open-ended sense of someday I'll slow down, someday I'll get to that. The transition Jung describes often brings a new, more concrete awareness that time is finite, and that's certain. Some days need to become actual decisions rather than indefinite postponements. This isn't necessarily morbid or anxious. For many people, it arrives instead as a kind of clarifying urgency, a sense that whatever's been quietly waiting has waited long enough. One of the reasons this transition catches so many people off guard is that modern culture, unlike many traditional societies Jung studied, offers almost no formal ritual or recognized structure for it. Graduations, weddings, the birth of a first child, these mark the first half's milestones clearly, publicly, with social recognition attached. There's no equivalent, widely shared marker for the shift Jung is describing. No ceremony announcing that the goals of the first half have been sufficiently met, and that a different kind of work is now beginning. Jung noted that many traditional and religious societies historically provided exactly this kind of structure: formal rites of passage into elderhood, spiritual frameworks explicitly oriented around the second half's task of deepening and integrating rather than building and achieving. Modern secular culture, by contrast, tends to treat the entire span of adult life as one continuous project: more achievement, more accumulation, more of the same first-half goals extended indefinitely, well past the point where they continue to genuinely serve someone. Without any cultural framework naming this shift, people going through it often assume something has gone privately wrong with them specifically. They compare their flatness or restlessness to peers who seem to still be running effectively on first-half fuel, and conclude they're uniquely broken, ungrateful, or failing at something everyone else has figured out, rather than recognizing a nearly universal transition that culture simply never gave them language for. This absence of shared language is, in itself, one of the more useful things this framework offers. Simply having a name and a structure for what's happening tends to reduce a significant portion of the private shame that often accompanies this period, replacing "something is wrong with me" with "this is a known, describable transition." It's worth noting, too, that this cultural gap tends to hit certain people harder than others, particularly those whose identity has been most thoroughly built around external markers of first-half success: title, income, visible status. The less someone's sense of self depends on those external markers, the more gently this transition tends to arrive. The more entirely someone's identity has been outsourced to first-half achievement, the more disorienting and occasionally frightening the eventual shift tends to feel once it finally announces itself. If the first half of life is about building a strong, functional identity through necessary one-sidedness, the second half, in Jung's model, is about something almost opposite: integrating the parts of yourself that identity building required you to set aside. This is the same territory covered by individuation, the concept we explored in an earlier video, but the stages of life framework adds something specific: a sense of timing, a reason why this particular work tends to become urgent precisely in midlife and beyond, rather than earlier. Jung argued that the psyche itself seems to push toward this second-half work once the first-half task has been reasonably accomplished, whether or not the person consciously wants it to happen. This is part of why so many successful, stable people find themselves unexpectedly unsettled in midlife despite having, by every external measure, already succeeded. The disruption isn't a malfunction. It's closer to a scheduled transition finally arriving, whether it's welcomed or not. Importantly, Jung didn't frame this second half as a rejection of everything built in the first half. The career, the relationships, the identity constructed earlier don't need to be discarded. The task is closer to expansion than demolition, making room for previously excluded parts of the personality alongside what was already built, rather than tearing down a life that, in most cases, still has real value and still deserves to be honored. So what does it actually look like to work with this transition deliberately, instead of just enduring it in confusion? Jung's clinical observations suggest a few concrete starting points. First, take the flatness seriously instead of immediately trying to fix it with more of the same. If a goal that used to motivate you now feels hollow, resist the reflex to simply set a bigger version of that same goal. Sit with the flatness itself for a while and ask what it might be pointing toward, rather than treating it as a problem to outrun through more achievement. Second, pay close attention to interests, curiosities, or qualities that resurface unexpectedly, especially ones you associate with an earlier, less specialized version of yourself: childhood interests, creative pursuits set aside for practical reasons, values you once held before career demands narrowed your focus. These resurfacing elements are often exactly the material Jung would consider ripe for integration during this period. Third, notice which roles and performances have started to feel effortful in a way they never used to. This doesn't necessarily mean abandoning those roles entirely. Most people can't simply walk away from a career or family responsibilities at midlife, and Jung never suggested they should. It means noticing the growing gap between the persona and the fuller self underneath it, and looking for small, sustainable ways to close that gap rather than ignoring it indefinitely. Fourth, resist the cultural pressure to interpret this entire experience as a crisis requiring a dramatic external solution. A sudden career change, a drastic reinvention, often undertaken specifically to avoid sitting with the more uncomfortable internal work the transition is actually asking for. Some external changes may genuinely be warranted, but Jung's model suggests the deeper work is internal first, and any external change made without that internal groundwork tends to simply recreate the same underlying dissatisfaction in a new setting. None of this requires a formal crisis to begin. The earlier someone recognizes the shift, even in its subtle early signals, the less disruptive the eventual transition tends to be, compared to ignoring it until it forces itself into view through more dramatic means. It also helps to expect this process to unfold gradually rather than arrive as a single moment of clarity. Most of Jung's patients didn't experience one decisive breakthrough that resolved the entire transition at once. They described something closer to a slow reorientation, small realizations accumulating over months or years, each one shifting their priorities slightly further from pure achievement and slightly closer toward a fuller, more integrated version of themselves. A common fear people have when they first recognize this transition is that honoring it will require blowing up the life they've built, the career, the marriage, the responsibilities that have defined their adult years so far. Jung's own clinical experience suggested something more measured. Integration, done well, rarely requires demolition. In practice, this often looks like smaller, more deliberate shifts than people initially expect. Someone who built an entire identity around professional competence might begin allowing themselves visible incompetence in a new pursuit, purely for its own sake, without needing to become skilled at it or justify the time spent. Someone who spent decades prioritizing others' needs might begin protecting small, regular periods of time for something that serves no one but themselves, without treating that as selfish or in need of elaborate justification. The relationships and responsibilities built during the first half often benefit from this integration work rather than being threatened by it. A parent or partner who has done some of this internal work tends to bring a fuller, less brittle version of themselves into those relationships, rather than the narrower, more one-sided version the first half's demands required. Jung's patients who successfully navigated this transition often reported that their existing relationships deepened during this period, not despite the internal work, but because of it. This is also often when Jung's concept of the golden shadow becomes especially relevant, qualities and strengths set aside earlier not because they were flawed, but because there wasn't room for them during the narrower, more specialized first half. Reclaiming them in the second half isn't correction. It's completion, adding back what always belonged to the fuller picture of who you are, but never had space to be expressed until now. This process tends to go more smoothly when it's approached with curiosity rather than urgency. Trying to force integration quickly, treating it like one more project to complete efficiently and move past, often backfires, recreating the same first-half pattern of achievement-driven pressure applied to a task that specifically requires the opposite quality: patience, openness, and a willingness to not know exactly where it's heading before you begin. Jung was careful not to frame the second half of life as a diminished version of the first, a slow decline after the real work is done. He argued the opposite. The second half offers access to a kind of depth and wholeness that simply isn't available during the necessarily narrow, specialized first half, precisely because the first half's task requires excluding so much of the total personality in order to accomplish anything concrete at all. People who engage seriously with this second half work often describe a quality of presence and groundedness that wasn't accessible to them earlier, not despite having let go of some first half certainties, but because of it. The achievements no longer have to carry the entire weight of self-worth alone. Relationships can be experienced more fully, without as much energy diverted into maintaining a narrower persona. Even ordinary daily experience often gets described as somehow more vivid, once less psychic energy is spent keeping excluded parts of the self at bay. This isn't a universal, automatic outcome. Jung was clear that this second-half work requires real engagement, and that plenty of people spend their entire later years still running on first-half rules, increasingly disconnected from a fuller version of themselves without ever quite understanding why. But for those who do engage with it, deliberately and honestly, the second half of life, in Jung's model, isn't a decline from the first. It's the part where the fullest, most complete version of a person finally has room to exist. If some part of this video felt uncomfortably familiar, a flatness you couldn't quite name, an old interest resurfacing unexpectedly, a growing exhaustion with roles that used to feel effortless, that discomfort isn't a sign anything has gone wrong. According to Jung, it's closer to a sign that something is finally on schedule. The first half of life asks you to become someone specific, capable of functioning successfully in the world. The second half asks something different and arguably harder, to become fully yourself, including the parts that first task never had room for. Neither half is more important than the other. They're simply different work, arriving in a different order, for reasons Jung believed were built into the structure of psychological development itself. If this helped you recognize a shift you've been living through without quite having language for, subscribe, because next week we're looking at another piece of Jung's work, one about a very specific kind of encounter that tends to change people permanently, whether they're looking for it or not. And before you go, if you're already past this transition, what changed for you and what would you tell someone who's just starting to feel it? Leave it in the comments. Your answer might be exactly what someone else watching needs to hear right now. Jung spent decades studying this shift in his patients, and eventually, candidly, in himself. He never described it as comfortable. He simply insisted it was necessary, and that avoiding it indefinitely tends to cost far more than meeting it honestly, whenever it finally arrives. There's a certain relief available, even in that discomfort, once you stop treating it as a problem exclusive to you. Nearly everyone who lives long enough encounters some version of this same threshold. The people who navigate it best aren't the ones who avoid the disorientation entirely. They're the ones willing to sit with it long enough to hear what it's actually asking for.